All right, let's jump right in. We're going to tackle a huge question today, but it's one that honestly affects every single one of us. What is political theory? And maybe more importantly, why on earth should you care? I know, it sounds super academic, right? But stick with me, because it's really about the basic rules we all live by.
So let's just start with something super basic. A question you've run into a million times, right? At home, at your job, even just planning something with friends. In any group, someone ends up making the calls. So the most basic political question of all is, who gets to make the rules?
And of course, that immediately leads to the next question, which is a lot tougher. I mean, it's one thing to have rules, but how do we know they're actually fair? What makes a government legit? Why should we follow their lead? And when is it okay to push back? These are the big, messy questions that societies are always grappling with.
And this, right here, is where political theory enters the chat. It's basically the field of study that's all about wrestling with these huge questions. And it's not just about, what politicians are debating this week. It's a much deeper look at things like authority, what justice even means, and the core values, freedom, equality, that are supposed to be the bedrock of our society.
And look, this is not some newfangled debate. We're talking ancient stuff here. Over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle dropped this famous line: "Man is by nature a political animal." Now, what he meant was that we're just wired to live in groups. We're social creatures. And the second you get a bunch of people living together, you have to start thinking about how to organize things. For him, being part of that conversation was part of what it meant to be fully human.
Okay, so this brings us to what is really the central drama, the core conflict at the heart of political theory. It's a debate that has shaped the whole field, and it boils down to this. Should we be studying politics as it is, or as it ought to be? Are we talking about cold, hard facts, or are we talking about values?
This chart lays it out perfectly. You've got these two main teams, right? In one corner, you have political science. Think of them as the detectives. They're all about what is. They're observing, collecting data, looking for clues, trying to figure out what's actually going on. Then, in the other corner, you've got political philosophy. They're more like the architects. They're focused on what ought to be. They're using logic and arguments to design the blueprint for a good, just society.
All right, let's dig into that first approach, the scientific one. The whole idea here is to look at politics through a microscope, to study the what is.
So the people who champion this approach, they want to get away from all the fluffy talk and ideals. They're like, forget what politicians say they believe. Let's look at what people actually do. They want to focus on what you can see and measure, how people vote, how decisions get made, how the machinery of government really works.
And they've got a whole method for this, a 4-step process. First, you just observe. You watch and gather the raw data. Then, step 2, you start connecting the dots, looking for patterns. That's generalization. Step 3 is the why. You try to explain why these patterns are happening. And the ultimate goal, step 4, is prediction. Can you use all this data to forecast what's going to happen next? It's all about trying to build a scientific theory of politics.
Okay, so let's flip over to the other side of the coin. If the science part gives us a detailed map of where we are, then the philosophy part is like the compass. It helps us figure out where we should go.
So what does political philosophy actually do? Well, a few really important things. First, it challenges the status quo. It asks, hey, is this really the best way to do things? Second, it's like a dictionary for our big ideas. It helps us get clear on what we even mean by words like justice or liberty. It also gives us the tools to back up our own beliefs with solid reasoning. And maybe the coolest part, it helps us imagine what a better society could even look like.
And this is so important. Think about it. How can a political scientist measure freedom if we haven't even agreed on what freedom is? You need philosophy first to define your terms. I mean, take a classic debate, like taxes. One side says, lower taxes, that's economic freedom. The other side says, no, higher taxes for social programs, that's equality. Now, a scientist can tell you the economic outcome of both plans, but science can't tell you which is better. Is freedom more important than equality in this case? That's a philosophy question, plain and simple.
Okay, so for a long time, especially around the middle of the 20th century, these two sides basically broke up. The science camp got really popular, and a lot of people started thinking the philosophy side was just old-fashioned and irrelevant. But this big split actually led to a massive crisis in the field.
You had guys like Alfred Cobbin back in the 50s saying that political theory was basically dead or dying. It felt like all the big, groundbreaking ideas about how to build a better society were gone. Instead, everyone was obsessed with this idea of a value-free science.
treating politics like it was just a machine, and people were just cogs in it, without any real values or morals. And this timeline really shows you the whiplash. So 1953, Cobbin says theory is in decline. Then through the 60s, this super scientific behavioral approach is king. It's all about data, data, data. But then, get this, in 1969, one of the biggest names in that very movement, a guy named David Easton, gets up and pulls a total 180. He basically says, you know what, we messed up.
It was a huge deal. Easton argued that with all the crises going on in the world, just sitting back and collecting data without any values was irresponsible. He was like, what's the point of all our charts and graphs if we can't use them to tackle real problems like war and poverty? He called for a post-behavioral revolution, a new era where science would actually be used to help achieve our values, not pretend they don't exist.
And just like that, the two sides got back together. This post-behavioral idea healed the rift. The big takeaway was that you absolutely need both. You need the science to tell you what's really going on, but you need the philosophy to give you a moral compass, to help you decide what to do about it. Okay, so that's a nice little story about some academics, right? But why should you care about any of this today? Well, because this combo, the science and the philosophy working together, is more important now than ever before. It's because any functioning society has to do these three things. First, description. You got to know what's happening. That's the science part. Second, criticism. You have to be able to look at the situation and ask, is this fair? Is this just? That's the philosophy part. And third, reconstruction. You need to be able to say, okay, how can we make this better? And that's where philosophy and science work together to build something new.
I mean, just think about the biggest challenges we're facing. Climate change, you need the scientific facts, no doubt. But you also need to talk about our values. What do we owe future generations? Feminism, you need the data on the pay gap, for sure. But you also need the moral argument about why that gap is wrong. It's simple. Facts show you the problem. Values tell you why you should fix it.
The political theorist David Held said it best. He basically warned that if we stop doing this hard work, if we stop thinking carefully about our world, we create a vacuum. And you know what fills a vacuum? Ignorance, self-interest, and people who just want power for the sake of having power.
And really, that's what it all comes down to. This isn't just some abstract thing for university classrooms. It's for all of us. Because, let's be honest, if we don't take the time to think deeply about how our society is run, somebody else will, and they'll be doing it for us.